Okay, welcome everyone. We are continuing with learning the book of Numbers. Today we're going to learn two different Torah portions. One is called Balak and one is called Pinchas. And these are very, very interesting stories. So I'm just going to tell the basic story of what happens in this Torah portion, and then we'll try to analyze what we can learn from it. So this is a story as Israel is coming close to entering into the promised land. So the king of Moab, his name was Balak, became very, very frightened, and he wanted to hire a magician to curse Israel, to cast a spell, to curse Israel. And the magician's name was Bilum. And at first, Bilum, who was very, very famous, didn't want to go with them. He offered him a lot of money. And eventually, God said, you can go, but you can only say what I put in your mouth to say. Now, there's a midrash that says that the nations of the world, a midrash is an allegorical story in which we learn deep things. So it says that the nations of the world came to God and said, if we had a prophet like Moses, we also would be great. We'd be ready to listen. So God said, okay, I'll give you Bilum. So this character, Bilum, is very mysterious because he had tremendous powers. He had tremendous powers, but he was very evil. So obviously there's a question, how does someone so evil have such powers that he talked to God and he had prophecy? That's not exactly what we're going to be talking about tonight, but I'm just trying to explain that he's a very mysterious figure because he was very powerful. And he had contact with God. But since we all have free will, he used those powers to curse people for pay. People would pay him to curse other people. And apparently his curses worked. So that's why Balak wanted to hire him. To make a long story short, Bilum comes, and 3 different times he really wants to curse the Jewish people. He does not want them to come into Israel. He does not want them to have a special relationship with God. And he really wants to curse them, but he knew well enough not to cross God. And God did not want to curse Israel. God wanted to bless Israel. So 3 different times he attempts to curse Israel. In the end, he gives amazing blessings. And then the 4th time, we're going to come back to this. The 4th time, he makes prophecies about the future. And the amazing thing is that his prophecies are in line with the Jewish prophets about what will happen at the time of the Messiah, at the time of the final redemption. So again, this character, Bilum, is very mysterious. Now, this whole story is happening. It's very unique because it's as if this is happening behind the back of Israel. In other words, this whole story is playing itself out as if Israel doesn't know that it's happening. which is very, very unique. In the end, Bilum is not able to curse the Jews, but he comes up with a different strategy. What is that strategy? I'll get the Jews to sin, to do very bad things, and they'll end up cursing themselves. And that's what happened. The king of Moab, Balak, he arranged that the women of Moab would try to seduce the men. And unfortunately, they began to succeed. And this is the whole portion. This whole story, it takes a whole portion to tell. All of you can go back and read the different times he tries to curse Israel, and instead he blesses Israel. But the end of the portion is Israel is starting to sin, and a plague breaks out in the camp, and people are dying. And one of the princes of Israel challenges Moses, and he takes one of the princesses of this other nation, and they're going to have sexual relations. And even Moses didn't know what to do. It was out of hand. The whole situation was out of hand. So what happened? A person called Pinchas, he is the grandson of Aaron, the high priest. And he comes and he kills this prince and this princess, and the plague stops. The plague was starting to consume the whole camp. 24,000 people died. And he killed these two people because what they were doing was terribly wrong. And it stopped the plague. And that's how the portion ends. Now, we're going to go back and discuss like what is happening here. But I want to really, really concentrate on this last story. This last story of what happened here with Pinchas and Moses and this whole scene, because the beginning of the next portion, which is called Pinchas, God gives Pinchas a covenant of peace. And in a few minutes, we're going to get to that covenant of peace and what it means. So now let's just understand, I want to go back because as everything in the Torah, there's so much to learn from every story, so much to learn. So we have very limited time, but I want to just take one idea that Bilum wanted to curse the Jews, but in a sense, God forced him to bless the Jews. So from this, we can learn a very interesting thing about blessings and curses. There are blessings that are blessings, meaning things happen in our life and they appear to be very good. They appear to be blessings. And that's exactly what they are. And then there are things that happen in our life that certainly seem to be very negative, very bad, not good at all. And that, for whatever reason, that's what they are. But then there are blessings that turn out to be curses, and there are curses that turn out to be blessings. I think everyone probably knows from your own lives. I know from my life that sometimes something happens, and the way I experience it is like, this is terrible. This is like, I don't know how this could be happening. And then a day later, a week later, a month later, a year later, 10 years later, I realized that this was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. It appeared to be, again, we're using the word curse as like something negative, something we would prefer not to happen. But it turns out that that was the best thing. It opened up all kinds of new opportunities. It forces us to change direction, to make changes in our life. And then there are things that appear to be blessings, and they turn out to be the worst thing for us. I'll give you an example. A young kid likes sweet things. So he's like bothering his mother. Oh, can I have some more candy? Can I have some more candy? More sweets, more sweets. And the mother gives the child. 2 hours later, the little kid has the worst stomachache because he ate all of these sweets, all of these candies. So in the beginning, the young child thought, wow, what a blessing. I get to eat all this candy, all this cake, all these cookies. And 2 hours later, it turns out it wasn't such a blessing after all. And here, what about the opposite? Let's say a young child is not acting properly. And the parents have to discipline. They have to teach their child what you're doing is not good. So the child, and they're punished. They're punished, whatever the punishment is. So for the child, this is like a curse. I'm being punished. But really, what the parents are, is the best thing they can do for their child. Because if they don't teach their child a proper way to act, it's certainly not going to be good. And so I'm saying all of this because Bilum, he wanted to curse the Jews, but what actually came out of his mouth were blessings. And then at the end, how did he end up cursing the Jews? He got the Jews to curse themselves by acting in a very, very wrong, immoral way. So this is something we can all apply to our own lives, that it's not so simple. What is a blessing and what is a curse? What is positive and what is negative? What's good and what's bad? We're actually told from the time that in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, until they ate, it was very clear what's good and what's not good. Once they ate from the tree, everything kind of got mixed together. So there, in a sense, there's no good in this world that doesn't have a potential seed of just the opposite. And also there's really no evil or bad in this world that doesn't have in potential a kernel of good that can come out of it. So just in a dramatic way, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand me and that there's any justification here, but only 3 years after the Holocaust, only 3 years after this terrible genocide against the Jewish people, miraculously, Israel was resurrected after 2,000 years. Now, this is a mystery. This is like, how does that work exactly? But you can see that this is a dramatic example, because could we think of anything worse, more evil than what happened in the Holocaust, in genocide? And yet what came out of it just 3 years later was for us, was a total miracle. Now, obviously, that doesn't justify the evil. That's why I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. It doesn't justify the evil, but it's hard to ignore the connection. So this is one of many, many things that we can learn from the story. Now, let's go back to the end of the story. The end of the story, again, there's very immoral things happening. A plague breaks out. 24,000 people died, and it's spreading. It's spreading. And so Pinchas comes and he receives Moses's permission, because in this case, this was the correct thing to do. It was like a death penalty from the court. And Pinchas killed these two individuals, and the plague stops. And in the next portion of Pinchas, God rewards him with a covenant of peace. So let's look at this a little bit deeper. There's very, very profound ideas here. So first of all, the Torah tells us what his weapon was. It's called a romach. A romach is a spear. It's a spear. But this word doesn't appear any other time in the 5 books of Moses. It's a very unusual word, romach. So we're told, I think you're aware that every Hebrew letter has a numerical value. First letter Aleph equals 1, second letter Bet equals 2. And the 22 letters go up to 400. And so every word in Hebrew has a numerical value. Now, if you have one word that has a numerical value and another word that has it, so the teaching is, well, what connects them? What's the connection between these two words that have the same numerical value? Just like in science today, whether it's physics or biology or chemistry, everything is numbers. In fact, the whole computer world is based on a binary mathematical code. 0, 1. 0, 1. That's our computer age, but it's all numbers. So also in the Torah, everything has a underlying mathematical code to it. So this word romach equals 248. So what is the significance of 248? We're told that we have 613 commandments in the Torah, 613 mitzvot. 248 are positive, and 365 are those things that we should not do. So what do we learn? That he took this spear that's called a romach. We're also told that the human body has 248 bones. In other words, our body, our skeleton, is made up of 248 bones. So this number represents the totality of the body, the totality of all the positive mitzvot, all the positive commandments. So Pinchas, in order to do what he had to do, he had to bring together his entire energy. Even Moses didn't know what to do. Even Moses didn't know what to do. And then Pinchas came to Moses and said, Moses, didn't you teach us that in this case, this is what should be done? And so Moses said a beautiful thing. He says, if you've read the letter, you should be the one to deliver it. In other words, you're right. The fact that you know what to do means you're the one to do it. So Pinchas went and he did what he did, but he had to take his whole being. So this teaches us something very, very important. Sometimes in life, we have to make very difficult decisions sometimes. We have to choose, or sometimes the consensus is going one way, but we know that what's happening is wrong. This is like in what's called peer pressure. Let's say all of one's friends are doing something, and you know it's not right. This is not right. And you take a stand. This happens in governments around the world, in politics. That's how change happens. Things are going along in a certain way, and someone or a group of people say, this is not right. But to do that takes tremendous energy, tremendous commitment, tremendous power. So that is represented in this romach, in this spear. Now we're going to learn something even deeper. I think most of you were here last week, and we looked at the story of Korach when he rebelled against Moses. And if you remember, the story is that the earth opened up and swallowed Korach. And we learned, and I discussed it briefly, the idea of reincarnation, and that many people are surprised that in Judaism we believe in reincarnation. That Korach was a reincarnation of Cain, and Moses was a reincarnation of Abel. And if you remember, these are the first two brothers, and Cain kills Abel, and God comes to Cain and says, the earth is crying out from the blood that it has swallowed. And so here it's what's called mida keneged mida, a measure for a measure. I used the word karma, that in the East, this concept of karma means a measure for a measure. And so because in a previous lifetime, Korach had killed Cain had killed Abel, now they both came back, and this time Korach is swallowed up. And the Torah uses the same words for swallowed up. So why am I telling you this? Because there's a very great secret in this story, a very great secret, because everyone asks, where did Pinchas get the strength to do what he did? Now, we just learned this idea with the Romach, that he had to take his whole being, his whole conviction, his whole strength. But still, how did he do that? So, if you remember, back in the book of Exodus, in the book of Leviticus, on the day that the tabernacle was inaugurated, so two sons of Aaron is the high priest, they took fire and they took incense and they went into the Holy of Holies, and they were not commanded to do this. They did it on their own decision. They didn't ask anyone, and they just did it. It turns out this goes back to what we were saying about a blessing and a curse. In their mind, what they were doing was something very good, something very, very great. But what happened? They so much wanted to give their souls over to God They didn't want to just bring an offering. They wanted to bring themselves, in a sense, as an offering. And it says that their souls were consumed. They died. So the great Kabbalist, perhaps you've heard of him, he's called the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria in Sfat about 500 years ago. So he revealed many, many deep secrets of the Torah and secrets of reincarnation. And so he said that the souls of these two sons of Aaron, their names were Nadav and Avihu, at the moment that Pinchas needed to gather up all of his strength, their souls entered into him, and they gave him the strength to do this. So this is a little bit of like a way out story. How does that work? So the Arizal explained that sometimes, it certainly doesn't happen to everyone, is that sometimes when, depending on the circumstances, a soul from the upper worlds will come, could be for 1 minute, it could be for 5 minutes, it could be for a year, in a sense, comes and helps us at the moment that we need them. So later, the sages said, what happened to Pinchas? What happened to him after this whole story? So the Talmud says, Pinchas ze Eliyahu. Pinchas, he reincarnated into Elijah the prophet. I hope everyone's heard of Elijah the prophet in the book of Kings. Many, many stories about Elijah the prophet. The most important one has to do with, at that time, the king of Israel, Achav, married a woman who believed in idol worship. And she brought this belief of idol worship into Israel, and people were following it. And Elijah the prophet, like, what am I going to do? Like, this is a terrible scene. So he organizes we're going to call it the contest of the gods. He says, I make a proposal to the priests of this idol worship. We're going to build an altar, and we're going to offer an animal. Whoever can bring fire down from heaven, that is who the real God is. Now here, Elijah was taking a real chance, because the priests of this idol worship, maybe they were like Bilum. Maybe they had magical powers. Anyways, all day long, the priests of Baal were praying to their God to bring fire down from heaven and to burn up this offering. And all day long, they could not do this. So then, at the end of the day, Elijah says, okay, you took all day, now it's my turn. And he took water and he poured it over the altar, which obviously would make a fire even more difficult. And he said a short prayer to God, and fire came down from heaven and consumed the offering. And when the people saw this, it was like, now we see who the real God is. So it's like a way out story. There's a lot we could learn from it. But they say that this is who Pinchas turned into. So one more story is when Elijah is about to die. So his student was Elisha. And again, you can go to the book of Kings and read all the stories about Elijah the prophet and Elisha the prophet. And Elisha says to his teacher, like, what am I going to do without you? And then he asks him, he says, how am I going to carry on without you? And Elijah says, if you see me ascend to heaven in a fiery chariot, you will get twice double my power, my energy. And so it says that, however we understand this, that Elisha saw Elijah ascending to heaven in a fiery chariot. Now, what's interesting, if you look in the book of Kings, Elijah performed 8 miracles. Elisha, who saw him ascend to heaven in a fiery chariot, performed 16 miracles, exactly twice. Remember what Elijah said to him? If you see me ascend to heaven in a fiery chariot, you will get twice my spirit. So Elisha does exactly twice as many miracles as Elijah does. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because there is a string that ties us all together. The 2 sons of Aaron, they didn't ask anyone, should we bring this fire offering into the Holy of Holies? And their souls were consumed in fire. So when Pinchas came, he asked permission from Moses. That was called a great rectification, because the souls of these 2 sons of Aaron entered into him, and they needed a fixing. They needed a rectification. And so, by asking Moses permission, they made the rectification that they needed, but they gave Pinchas the strength to do what he did. Now, Pinchas becomes Elijah in a different lifetime. He becomes Elijah. And Elijah, his greatest act was bringing fire down from heaven and proving to all of Israel who is the true God, and the people listened to him. It was very dramatic what he did, but he knew that he had to do something dramatic here. And then he ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot. So you see how fire runs through this whole story. And this is the fire of these 248 positive commandments, that when Pinchas took the spear and he brought all of his energy together, this is the fire of commitment, the fire of dedication, the fire of doing what one has to do. Okay, now we're going to take this and try to understand a very basic question. However we understood it, Pinchas killed 2 people. But what did he, okay, first of all, Moses told him that in this case, this is what Jewish law approves of. And if he wouldn't have done it, the entire camp would have been consumed with this plague. So he literally saved Israel. And so God rewarded him with a covenant of peace. Now, in the Torah, some letters are written differently than usual. Sometimes in the Torah, you'll get a letter that's actually written big. Sometimes you'll get a letter that's written small. Sometimes there'll be a dot over a letter. These are all hints that there's something deeper happening here. So in the words for a covenant of peace, the letter Vav is written and there's a space that breaks it in half. Now, usually for a scroll of the Torah to be what's called kosher, to be usable, there can be no blemishes in the letters. If there's a letter in the Torah that's supposed to be written a certain way and half of it is, let's say, erased, you can't read publicly from this Torah. It must be fixed. It becomes invalid. And yet, here's a letter that's broken in half. But that's how it's supposed to be. Now, why? What is this teaching us? Because it's the obvious question. How can someone merit a covenant of peace through violence? How can that be? So the broken Vav is teaching us that ideally, this should not be the case. We should be able to reach peace through peace. But if we look at the world, and I'll give an example from World War II. In the beginning, the nations of the world, and especially in Europe, tried to placate Hitler. Hitler took over this area, and then he took over that area, and then he took over another area. And each time the world said, oh, we don't know what to do here, but let's not confront this guy. And of course, the famous story when the Prime Minister of England came and thought that he had made a deal, and he comes back and says, peace in our times. And of course, a year later, World War II breaks out, and Hitler was, in the beginning, unstoppable. So here you have an example. You have an example where after World War II, who became very good friends? Germany and the United States became good friends. But to get there, Hitler had to be stopped. And since he was demanding violence, sometimes you have to meet violence with violence. It's not the preferred way, and we wish it wouldn't be like that. It was the same thing between the United States and Japan. Japan attacked America in Pearl Harbor, and America fought back for a number of years. 5 years after World War II, who are the best of friends now? Japan and the United States. So I'm just using this as an example, but it only happened because America had no choice. It was attacked. It had no choice. So here, this is a classic example because everything in the Torah is an example for us. So here we're seeing that sometimes, even though we wish it wouldn't be like that we could just make peace in a peaceful way. But when a person or a country or a community is under attack and has no choice, then to ultimately reach peace, you have to fight back. But the Torah breaks this letter in half. In the word shalom, in the word peace, it's broken. It's like a broken piece. So there's one other secret here is that in the first verse of the Torah, so the letter Aleph appears 6 times. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. So the letter Aleph appears 6 times. Now, the letter Aleph, the name of the letter also has a meaning. It has many meanings, actually. One of the meanings is Aleph. Aleph means 1,000. Now, here you have a great paradox because the number of the letter Aleph is 1, but the meaning of the word is 1,000. So this is a great, this is a secret of the way the world is. The world appears to have plurality, meaning there's millions, billions, trillions, quadrillions of entities out there. And yet our belief is it's all a part of the oneness of God. Ultimately, it's all one. Even science says there's 4 cardinal forces in the universe: gravity, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. And science understands that these are not 4 independent forces. Ultimately, they're all united. And this is one of the great quests of science. And they're almost there, actually. They're almost there to understand how these 4 forces work together. So this letter appears 6 times. So that hints to 6,000. So our sages said that this cycle of history will last for 6,000 years, and the 7,000th year will be when the Messiah comes. In other words, just like God created the world in 6 days, and then there was Shabbat, the Sabbath, so too history will follow the same cycle, 6,000 years, and then the 7,000th year. We also have it in right now in Israel. We learned this. I think many of you were at the class. We learned about the sabbatical year. This year in Israel is a sabbatical year. It's the 7th year. So we work our fields. We do agriculture for 6 years. And then the 7th, we rest. So why am I saying all of this? Because the letter Vav, this is the letter that's broken in the word shalom, in the word peace. Vav equals 6. So what's being hinted to is that for 6,000 years, the attempt to reach real peace is broken. And obviously we look around the world, and at any given time, there's probably 20 different wars happening in the world, big and small. Many of them are small. In this country, there's this movement, but there's always wars. There's always wars. So this is alluding to, it's hinting to, that the quest for peace, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. The Vav is broken. And yet, we believe strongly that we will get there. We will get there. Okay, one more point. One more point is, as I said, the name of this, the second portion that we're learning, that's where the covenant of peace is called Pinchas. And I mentioned before that it doesn't happen that often, but sometimes some letters are big and some are small. So in the name Pinchas, even though he's mentioned many times in the Torah, in this one place, there's a small letter in his name, a small yud. Yud is the smallest of the Hebrew letters. And it's actually called the little that holds a lot. It's a very small letter, but it's actually the first letter in God's four-letter name. So it's a very important letter, but it's small. So what can we learn from this? Why is this letter small in the name of Pinchas? So from this, we learn a very, very important thing about leadership. Okay, here, Pinchas goes and he does what he does. So you might think after that, he's going to be like, whoa, I'm Mr. Macho. Look what I did. I'm the greatest. No, Pinchas had so much humility. He did what he had to do, but he didn't make a big deal out of it. And this little letter in the name of Pinchas, as we said, every letter in the Torah is archetypal. Every letter in the Torah we can learn infinite things from. But this becomes a model for the Jewish people of what leadership should be. Unfortunately, in the world today, we're used to politicians, dictators, monarchs. Most people in the world do not have like a high expectations of their leaders at this point. There's a lot of ego, a lot of power, money behind leadership. In the Torah, we don't really have the time, but there's story after story of Jewish leaders that did their best not to be the leader. They didn't run after. Pinchas didn't run after the circumstances that made him do what he did. It presented itself. He did what he had to do. He asked permission and he did it. The greatest example is Moses. If you remember, when God appeared to him at the burning bush, so according to tradition, Moses argued with God for a full week, saying, I can't do it. I'm not good enough. I'm not capable. You can find someone better. Go to my brother. He's much better than me. Here's a classic example of God coming and saying, I want you to be the leader. And the person saying, I'm not the one. I'm not capable. And this happens throughout Jewish history. That's this little letter Yud in the name Pinchas. And there are many, many examples. Joshua, who became the leader after Moses, that was the last thing he wanted to do, is to be the one to lead Israel into the promised land. He sat by Moses for 40 years, and he was Moses' greatest student, but he was like he served him. He loved him with his whole heart. The last thing he wanted to do was for Moses to die and for him to have to lead the people in. And when an angel came to Gideon and said, God has chosen you to save Israel from its enemies. Again, Gideon was like, I'm not the right person. I can't be the leader. King Saul, the first king of Israel, also, when Samuel came. All of these stories are in the Bible, but this is what's called a model. And about Moses, if you remember, in the book of Deuteronomy, and actually the book of Numbers, we already got to it. The whole idea is that the Torah says itself that Moses was the most humble person on the face of the earth. So how does it happen that someone could be such a great leader and be humble and have humility at the same time? But that is, for us, that is the model of leadership. Not someone who wants the position so they can have power and they can rule over people and they can make a lot of money on the side and hidden bank accounts. That's not what leadership is about. Okay, so I think hopefully we learned something very, very interesting about these two portions. Of course, there's always so much more to learn. And I bless us all that our desire to learn more is never quenched. That we always, no matter how deep we get, we have to know that there's even deeper understandings, and we should all be blessed to keep that desire going.